大家好，我是吴华阳，百文会的会长，我是美国人。Good morning, friends. My name is Frank Wu. I have the honor of serving as the chair of the Committee of 100, and I'm an American. Our time has come. For so long, Asian Americans, Chinese especially, have been stereotyped as apathetic or self-interested, not involved in the hurly-burly of the public square, not interested in politics, not exercising our rights and fulfilling our responsibilities. We have never had a Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton, and whatever you may think of the strategies or tactics of those leaders, there is no doubt that if anything happens to someone who's African American, if rights are violated, if a wrong is done, if an injustice is perpetrated, there will be spokespeople, there will be rallies, there will be letters to the editor of the newspaper, legislators will be visited, and a movement will be started. That has not been so for Chinese Americans, not until now. At last, we are standing up and speaking out, and this moment is ours. As we enter a Pacific era, as Asian migration to the United States changes the face of this nation, it is up to us to live up to the ideals that drew us here, the principles that bind us together in a civic culture, a diverse democracy, people whose ancestors are from so many different lands, who speak different languages at home, practice various faiths. It is up to us. I'd like to share with you a personal story about how I came to be interested in these issues. I share this story because I urge all of us to share our stories, to write our own stories, a different script, not following the stereotype. Each of you in this room has a similar story, something that compelled you to give up your time, to put your energy into community organizing, to say that as much as you care about your own individual career success and your families, that you also want to give back, that you recognize that there is strength in these numbers, that there is an opportunity for us, that there is an obligation that we owe to children and grandchildren to make this place better. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan in the 1970s and 1980s, in our nation's heartland. My father worked for Ford Motor Company. We were the only Oriental family on the block. That term was still in use then, more appropriate for rugs than people, connoting a certain exoticism, as if we should be halfway around the world, not there on Sunnydale Lane in Northville in a Detroit suburb. And to tell you the truth, when I was a kid growing up, and I'm ashamed to admit this now, but I was always a little embarrassed of my parents. I was embarrassed of them and a little bit angry. I'd like to explain why. I was embarrassed because that was a time before multiculturalism, before diversity. Those terms were not used. The notion of being different was not celebrated. No, we were to assimilate, to be exactly like everyone else. I was to be just like the neighbors and their children. And yet we weren't. We weren't, and that meant that when I went to school virtually every day, there was the teasing and taunting, the common cruelty of childhood, the racial slurs on the playground, you know, chink, jap, gook, being asked if my parents were communists, if we ate dogs, how I could see with eyes like that, and so on and so forth, being challenged to karate fights and kung fu matches, that sing-song chant, Chinese, Japanese, dirty knees, what are these? And then kids would pull their eyes back in a slant and laugh and run away. As the adults who supervised looked on and just said, well, say that sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. You know, it's funny, kids suffer all sorts of physical injuries, but they bounce back. They fly off swings and break their arm, and they're proud to wear a cast. But those fighting words, the words, they leave a psychic trauma that I don't think I'm all that sensitive, but even to this day, chink and jap and gook, they're more powerful than a punch that a kid could throw. And when I went home and told my parents about this, they would scold me and they would tell me to work harder in school and try more to fit in. And so I thought that they were blaming me for all of this, and I, to be honest, sort of blame them, because when I was in kindergarten, one of my classmates asked me, why are you Chinese? As if to say, what are you doing here? And I didn't really know why I was Chinese, but I figured it was because my parents were. And so I went home and I said to my mother, why are we Chinese after all? And she didn't have a very good answer. But I knew that because we were Chinese, there was something different, and that meant something wrong. My parents spoke with accents. We ate funny foods, that other kids would turn their noses up at. My dad was always trying to get me to try some chicken feet, for example. And when my mother would make a 5-course meal with a steamed whole fish, my brothers and I, we would demand pizza and hamburgers and hot dogs and meatloaf, just like the kids who lived next door. In that embarrassing role reversal that the children of all newcomers experience, we sometimes had to be interpreters and translators for our parents if there was a dispute with the phone company or something along those lines. And when they watched television, American sitcoms, my parents didn't quite laugh at the right time. They sometimes missed the joke. And so that's what it seemed to me as a child was going on, that my parents weren't in on the joke, and sometimes the joke was on us. I figured that when I grew up, and I was very eager to grow up and be like my dad and shave and drive and go off to work, that I wouldn't face any of these issues. Little did I know that my parents faced all of this as well. They faced all of this, only it was the sophisticated adult version, that when they went to the bank to get a loan, when they tried to buy a house, when they did anything out there, just taking us shopping for groceries, that they would get dirty stares, that sometimes people would do things that they wouldn't do to others. They would tell us that they wouldn't serve us, and as a kid, it was perplexing. We didn't quite understand. Sometimes people would do things like break the window of our car and so on and so forth. It was nothing that terrible. I'm not cataloging complaints. I didn't go to bed hungry at night. I grew up relatively privileged. But that's what it was like to be a Chinese American family in the Midwest in the 1970s. And my parents, there was nobody that they could complain to. They didn't quite understand either. For you see, they didn't speak the language of civil rights. They literally spoke another language. And I didn't speak the language of civil rights because, I was just a kid. Over time, I came to sacrifices that my parents had made. I came to see that I could never do what they had done for my brothers and me, that I would not be able to achieve any of what I have now, were it not for the example they set, encouraging us to study hard, to become educated, and to do our best at all times. The standards they set, that's what inspired us, even though they didn't display love and affection the same way as the other parents in the neighborhood. So my embarrassment for my parents, I've come to see, as I am now the age that my father was when I went off to college, and I thought he was pretty old then. I've come to see that they were right about so much, and that debt that our generation, born in America, has is a debt that we must acknowledge to those of you who did something we couldn't do, learned a new language, put down new roots, moved halfway around the world. And so it was that when I was a kid, if you had asked me about these issues, civil rights, race, diversity, ethnicity, I wouldn't have wanted to talk about any of this. I just wanted to be normal, to fit in, to ride my bicycle around the block. I'd like to explain why that changed. Something happened. Something happened in 1982 in my hometown. There was a man named Vincent Chin. This name is known to anyone who studies Asian Americans, but virtually unknown to others. I'm writing a book about his story and his case right now, and I'll just share a little bit of it. I didn't know Vincent Chin, but I grew up just a few miles from where he grew up. He was older than me by a little more than a decade. And what happened to him was this. He was 27 years old, a Chinese American. He was not the model minority. He was not a whiz kid, rocket scientist, child genius. No, he had dropped out of college. He had gone back to school to become a draftsman. He worked as a busboy and sometimes a waiter at different Chinese restaurants, as his father had before him. And he had found a nice young lady to settle down with, also of Chinese descent, also salt of the earth from the Cantonese-speaking inner city Chinese culture, restaurant owning. And they were due to be married. And on June 19th, 1982, Vincent Chin, being all-American, did what guys do when they're about to be married. He went out for a bachelor's party. with some buddies of his. And he was no saint. They went to a seedy part of town to a strip club. And this, you'll have to recall, was at the height of a recession even worse than what we've just been through, where employment hit the double digits. It was even worse in the Motor City. And where there was a fear of the rise of the East, the decline of the West. The enemy then was not China, it was Japan. You remember, Japan Inc. was said to be taking over. The Japanese were buying national landmarks. People called it an economic Pearl Harbor as Japan thrived and prospered and America sank ever further. And in Detroit, where everyone worked for a car company, recall that's why we were there. My dad was at Ford Motor Company. He was part of this community, a community of engineers and researchers and scientists who all worked for the car companies. That's what everyone in Detroit did. Well, that meant that we were even more threatened. Detroit was probably the hardest place in the 70s and 80s to have an Asian face, because you had the face of the enemy. You looked like the people who were making those cars. And there was a congressman in Detroit who said, if you want to know who to blame for the economic decline of the Motor City, he said, it's little yellow men. Little yellow men. In a famous speech that he gave, he repeated that phrase again and again and again. And so people couldn't tell whose side we were on, and they would ask us. They would ask us that. Which side are you on anyway? And I'm sure they asked Vincent Chin that. So that particular night at his bachelor's party with these buddies of his at a strip club, Chin was watching the show, enjoying himself. He'd had a little bit to drink, and I think it's important that he was just a guy. He didn't set out to be a civil rights icon, much less a martyr. He just wanted to have a good time, settle down, get married. But there were two other gentlemen at that club, auto workers. They were white, a father and a stepson, and one of them was unemployed. And they looked over at Chin, and according to witnesses, multiple witnesses would report, they used slurs, those same epithets that I recall from the playground. Chink, Jap, something you don't even hear anymore, nip. And even though Chin said, I'm Chinese, not Japanese, they persisted. And then finally one of them, according to one of the witnesses, not one of Chin's friends, but according to one of the dancers, one of those men, one of those auto workers, looked over at Chin and shouted, you have to pardon the language, but this is what the witnesses reported, shouted, you little motherfucker, it's because of you motherfuckers that we're out of work. Meaning that never mind that Chin was Chinese, not Japanese, never mind that he was an American, not a foreigner, in the eyes of his attackers, well, he represented Tokyo and Toyota. This was mistaken identity twice over. Not that it would have been any better had they singled out someone Japanese or foreign to beat up. But as we used to hear and still do, you all look the same. Before the evening was out, after challenging one another to a fight, and there was a scuffle inside that bar, and they went out in the parking lot, and the altercation continued. Well, after the sun had set off of Woodward Avenue, the major thoroughfare that connects the inner city to the suburbs, the two gentlemen found Chin, and they took a baseball bat they had in the trunk of their car, and using that baseball bat, a weapon that meant that they had to swing it themselves. They had to put their muscle, their energy into this. They bludgeoned him. They struck him repeatedly on the head, the torso, the arms. Witnesses would say it looked like the stepfather, the fellow swinging the bat, was trying to hit a home run. They literally cracked his head open, and with blood and spinal fluid and cerebral matter pooling onto the pavement beneath him, he crumpled, uttering the last words, "It's not fair." He lapsed into a coma from which he would never recover. The emergency medical tech who came to the scene said, "Nobody survives a head wound like that." Brought to nearby Henry Ford Hospital, he lingered on life support for a few days before the family ordered that the plug be pulled. So the guests who would have attended his wedding went to his funeral instead. The story doesn't end there, for those of you who know it. It doesn't end there at all. It would have been bad enough had someone been brutally beaten to death for doing nothing wrong, but for being associated with an enemy nation that they actually, in fact, had no relationship with. A Chinese American, working class kind of guy, no different than his attackers, except for the color of skin, the texture of hair, the shape of eyes. But what happened next was that sober, cleaned up, dressed in their Sunday best, represented by legal counsel, the two perpetrators appeared in court. They never denied that they did what they did. They always admitted that they had attacked Chin, but they said this wasn't about race, this wasn't about ethnicity, it had nothing to do with hate, it was merely a bar brawl. It got out of hand. And so the judge sentenced these two individuals who admitted that they used a baseball bat to crack somebody's head open, killing him. They were sentenced to probation for 3 years and a fine of $3,000 each. That led to something never seen before nor since. A national protest movement. Vincent's grieving mother, Lily Chin, speaking with a heavy accent toward the nation, came to places all over, Los Angeles and San Francisco, Chicago and New York, I think probably Washington, D.C. too. And people hadn't seen a spectacle such as this. Asian Americans, angry, marching, protesting, giving speeches. They formed an organization called American Citizens for Justice. American Citizens for Justice. They wanted to emphasize that they too were Americans. They made a rule that at the rallies, all signs had to be in English. They didn't want anyone making any mistake. They also didn't want any conflict about whether people would use traditional or simplified characters. So everything was done in English. And ACJ, well, it tried to bring people together, and it did. There had been a Yellow Power movement in San Francisco in 1967, but that was limited by geography, by time, and by generation. The Vincent Chin case brought together the immigrants and the native-born, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, African Americans, and Hispanics. The local NAACP endorsed the movement, for example. Catholics and Jews supported this because of the brutality of the killing. And the death of a man was the birth of a movement. That is when people recognized that Asian Americans had to come together with Pan-Asian identity and insisting that they were Americans. And for me, as just a teenager, this was the moment. I hadn't ever wanted to think about these issues. I wasn't planning to be a lawyer. I wanted to be an architect. I had a drafting table that I sketched on in the basement of our house. But this Chin case was the key that unlocked a box that I didn't even know existed. And inside that box was everything that had happened to me, that jumble, that confusion of the teasing and taunting, of everything that had made me ashamed of my own ancestry and heritage. And this explained that it wasn't my fault, it wasn't my parents' fault, that there was something out there, racial discrimination. As great as the ideals of this nation, the promise that it held, the American dream that had beckoned to my parents when they watched Hollywood movies in Taiwan and dreamed of the gold here, like so many Chinese before them, it was a little bit tarnished, but I just didn't understand what had happened in my entire life until this incident. Because when you're a racial minority, and for Asian Americans, sometimes we're not even acknowledged as racial minorities, we're characterized as perpetual foreigners, not part of the body politic, but belonging to a different sovereignty, loyal not to this nation, but to somebody else, a potential threat from the inside. Well, when you are a racial minority and you grow up in isolation without critical mass, not like in San Francisco where there's a Chinatown or New York City, but in Detroit, in the nation's heartland, well, you figure that all of this is just in your head, right? All of these issues, that your powerlessness, that's the way it is and should be and always will be. But this Chin case inspired me. It made me angry, and I tried to use that anger to learn the power of words. Not just the angry racial slurs that were directed at Chin before the brutal beating, but the power of words to persuade, to bring open-minded people together, to form coalitions, to build bridges. Most East Asian cultures have an equivalent of that Japanese proverb that you may know, that the nail that sticks up is pounded down. That encourages submissiveness, deference to authority, fidelity to tradition, not making a fuss. That the loudest duck is shot first by the hunter. Compare that to the American adage, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, which is all about making a fuss. It's all about standing up, speaking out, and so when Asian Americans come together, when Chinese Americans hold a conference such as this, we demonstrate that we have embraced American ideals, that we will not take it, that we will agitate, we will organize, we will fight back, and we will learn the law. We will be, yes, scientists and engineers, as my parents were. That's so important. That's how people come here. It's how they acquire a green card. But if we are to be a complete community, we need activists, we need artists, we need people who represent us. And every one of us, the engineers and scientists, no different, has to take a little bit of time to participate, to do this. Well, now that I am an adult and grown up, and Detroit in the 1970s are far behind me, I see how important it is as we continue to do this work that it always be animated by, driven by principle and ideals, not by self-interest and self-aggrandizement, that it means that we must come together. And as you heard from Congress people from all over this nation of every ethnic background, they know, and we are learning, that to achieve political success, to be empowered, we can't do it by ourselves. It means that we must reach out to everyone else. And just to say that you are Chinese American, to say then that you are Asian American, to say that you are an activist American, that is to build bridges. Because in China, well, people identify by province, by clan, by dialect. They will break themselves down in so many different ways. And in Asia, there are no Asians. Nobody in Asia, except for imperialists, calls themselves an Asian. They see themselves by a much more distinct ethnicity. But here, when we declare those identities, we say we will put behind us the hostilities that our grandparents may have had for each other. We will ignore and put aside and respect that people have different origins, whether mainland or Taiwan or Hong Kong, that they have different dialects, different religious faiths, different class backgrounds, different partisan interests, but that together we see a common cause. There's much more for us to do. In my career, what made all the difference, and I'll stop here and take a few questions, and I encourage you to tell your stories, because my story is just one of many, and I'm not here just to share my story, but to listen to yours, to ask how we together can be empowered. What was most important for me was that the bulk of my academic career was spent just a few miles from here in our nation's capital at Howard University, the nation's leading historically black college, where by standing behind a podium in a classroom that was predominantly black, I made a statement every day about bridge building, whether I intended to or not. And I learned from my students as much as I taught them about the prejudices I myself had and the privileges I enjoyed without noticing. That's what it takes for us to come here to be in this ballroom, but then to invite someone who we know, who's not of Chinese descent, who may be of Japanese or Korean or Filipino descent, and then next someone who is Chicano or African American or of Arab background. And for this ballroom to grow in size until it is filled in capacity with people who believe that diversity and democracy are twin principles that reinforce each other, that by standing up and speaking out, we will make a difference, that vision of America as a city upon a hill that attracted each of you, not just for the opportunity that you would be able to find here for yourselves and your children, your descendants in material terms, but for the openness, for the opportunity to be who you are, to write the script of your destiny, to have your fate in your hands, not as in the old country and feudal systems, but that this opportunity is presented before us. It is ours to seize. I say to you again, our time has come. Let us stand up and speak out. Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to do it.
Yes, yeah. And Professor Frank Wu would like to take several questions. And let's do a 5 to 10 minutes Q&A. For those people who would like to ask questions, please kindly line up at either side of this. Oh, we have only one side of the boom mic. So please line up over here and ask your questions. And when you ask questions, may I please kindly ask you to actually ask the question instead of making a long statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. And thank you so much for sharing your experience on your insight. My name is Li Kun Wang from Northern Virginia. And my question is how and why you think the Chinese American is different from other ethnic group. For example, the African American group, how they can mobilize it and voice their concern and really fight for their civil rights. Thank you.
We're different and yet the same. There are both internal and external factors, and I'll be honest with you about both, and we need to address both. So there's the internal factor. I've met more than one young person, college graduate who's interested in being an activist, who's thinking about going to law school, whose parents discourage that. Because, well, as my parents did, and I understand now. When I said I wanted to go to law school and I was admitted to a top 10 institution, my parents were puzzled by that because they didn't know any lawyers, and law didn't have the same status in Asia that it does here in the United States, where when you look at who sits in Congress, who sits in the White House, so many are people trained in law and the art of advocacy. And I understand now, because my parents had internalized the effects of racial discrimination. If you work with numbers, numbers are numbers. It doesn't matter what your accent is, it doesn't matter what culture you grew up in. If you're good at math and science, you can do that anywhere. But law is a little bit different. You have to be able to stand up and speak out, and if you have an accent, you will face bias. It's not right, but you will face it. And it isn't easy for Asian Americans, stereotyped as good at math and science, which is a compliment, but it's also an insult, as if that's all we're good at. We lack people skills, we can't be leaders, you know, it's the idea that we're just mechanical and soulless. And so there are internal factors here at work when people are discouraged by those who don't see the need. All it takes is for a case like the Sherry Chen case, the Dr. Shi case, the Wen-Ho Lee case before that. If it were just one case, well, we could say that was an aberration, it was a mistake, but it's not just one case. It's case after case after case, and they have this pattern to them. But until it happens to you, until you realize that the FBI could come knocking on your door, drag you away in handcuffs, put you in solitary confinement, threaten to throw you in prison for life, and destroy your reputation, well, I understand human beings and human nature. We all just want to get on with our own careers, and we think, well, why bother with the protest? Why should we join with African Americans and others to do this or that? And I hear Asian Americans say from time to time, no, that's for black people to do, march and protest and write letters to the editor. Well, it's not. It's for all of us, and Asian American activism now is on the rise, and it's great to see. So there are the internal factors, our own inhibitions that we must address. All of you here have done that. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for that. But ask yourself this: do you have a cousin who's Asian American who says to you, why are you wasting your time? Why would you go to a conference with all these other Chinese people and talk about all these issues? Couldn't you be doing something else to advance your career? That's who I'm trying to talk to, our cousins. The external factor is because we're stereotyped as perpetual foreigners, you hear that heckler's jeer, right? Someone always shouts, if you don't like it here, you can go back to where you came from. Well, my reply to that is things aren't that much better in Detroit. So this is where we have come from, and for almost all of us, this is where we will now make our lives. To tell you the truth, the world has changed around us. The rise of transnationalism, technology, WeChat, there's a whole virtual community out there that didn't exist when I was just a kid in Detroit in the 70s. And yes, some Chinese immigrants are here temporarily. They're not immigrants, they're sojourners, as was the stereotype. They will be educated here, start their careers, but they'll return to Shanghai or Beijing, and that's fine too. There's nothing wrong with that. China and the US are bound together. But for those of us who are immigrants, who are native born, who are third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation, who are of mixed background, who are adopted, we must insist that this is where we belong.
Can I ask from this? Okay.
And you know, I'm afraid that we're using my friend Karthik's time. So there's another panel this afternoon that I'll be a part of on bridge building, and I am happy to talk with every one of you. Do you want to take another 1 or 2 questions? And I'll be very brief.
Sure, yeah.
Should be this.
I was going to say that before we take the next question, I was going to ask you whether you would like to limit your answer to 1 minute so that you could take more questions, or you want to give longer answers of fewer questions.
I'll be
Your
very
choice.
brief, so I'll answer as quickly as I
We'll
can. Yes.
put you on a test, so every answer will be timed at 1 minute.
All right. Okay.
All right, go ahead. Next question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wu, for a very inspiration speak. Thank you very much. I think I have always think about the question. So for Asian America, we are so diversified. Okay, you have different religion, different zones, all these different things. So what do you think actually in your mind? Do we have any core values? Okay, how do we build those core values to unite Asian American? Because right now it's so diversified, this group. It's really, really hard to unite it. So
Yes.
what's your think?
Very, very briefly, 2 possibilities. One is, even though we have our own personalities in politics and different experiences, one core value is that we should not be attacked as Vincent Chin was, that we should not be stereotyped as Sherry Chen and Dr. Shi have been, that when we are persecuted, when we are wrongly because of racial profiling, when we are singled out and targeted, that is wrong. So that's been a cause for every civil rights group in every community: mutual defense, anti-stereotyping, refusing to be subordinated, to be subjected to wrongdoing. The other potential cause, and this is not without its risks, but the Committee of 100 has embraced it since it was founded 27 years ago, is bridge building between the U.S. and China. We have an ability, not just an affinity, not just how we look, but our ability to understand culture and language, to reach out so that when we travel to Beijing as Americans, we send a different signal, it's a different message than when our coworkers and neighbors do, and so we can reduce tension and misunderstanding and play a productive role as bridge builders.
Hi, Professor Wu. Thank you so much for speaking. Your speech is very inspirational. You mentioned the case of Vincent Chin and also the multicultural political movement that happened after that, which I think draws a lot of parallels to what's going on in our nation right now with a lot of the police shootings and the Black Lives Matter movement. But to me, it seems the Black Lives Matter movement hasn't really drawn the same kind of multicultural following. And I was wondering, what is your opinion on how to get more people than just the African American community involved in this? Because it seems like an issue that should affect all of us.
Yes, the hardest thing is to see that it isn't only Vincent Chin, who looks like he could be our uncle or brother or us, but that there's a principle at stake. That the racial profiling that affects Sherry Chen and Dr. Shi is the same as affects people of Arab descent, same as affects African Americans when they're driving and they're pulled over for no good reason or for a busted taillight that the rest of us, well, we wouldn't be pulled over for that. It's the same as the notion that everyone of Hispanic descent is undocumented and is here to commit a wrong. What is at stake here is the notion that we are not judged by ethnicity, by the color of our skin. So your answer, I would say, the answer to your question is it's up to us to see this. It's not up to African Americans to persuade us. We have to come around to seeing that if we want other people's help, we have to lend a hand first. And every single Asian American in public life knows this. Everyone elected to be governor or a member of Congress, they're all running in districts that are not predominantly Asian. They have to appeal to whites and blacks and Hispanics. That's another way we can build bridges, because we can see more than one perspective. The world is not literally, nor is it figuratively, black and white. It's on us, as the kids would say. I think I can just take one more question.
Yeah, I was going
because,
to.
Because I persuaded my good friend Karthik to come, and he is great, and he's got all this data, and I told him, this is an Asian audience, bring all the data, they're really going to love it, all right? So you really want to hear him. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. It's Qinghua Ling, I'm from New York. I'm a quintessential first generation Chinese immigrant. I'm an engineer and speaking with a Chinese accent. I would say,
And that's great.
Two quick questions. One is that at this time, what do you see are the most urgent thing we can do as a community? And second half question is that long term, how we should do going forward. Thank you.
There's so much to be done. Half of success in life is just showing up. The other half is showing up again. So, you know, not just showing up here, but at the local event held by the any other group, the NAACP, the American Jewish Committee, National Council of La Raza, to make sure that you are there for them. Not just to pose for a photo, not just in a token manner, but that you will get up early and march and carry a sign. Just showing up. Showing up means so much. You know, I'll close with this thought. People have sometimes said to me, well, haven't we achieved what we need to achieve? Aren't we post-racial now? Don't we all understand that stereotyping is wrong? The events of the past 18 months, it seems to me, have proven that in no way are we post-racial. Race matters now as much as it ever has, even more. Tensions are high, relations are fraught, there is suspicion all around. Suspicion in every way, and there are those who would be destructive and appeal to the worst parts of our nature, the voices in our head that are not constructive, that are only angry, and that don't channel that toward coalitions and bridge building. Every day, every single day now, when you pick up the newspaper, you go on the web and read a news article, China is in the news, and it's almost always negative. Doesn't matter what the issue is. There are people who talk about war, that war will come, that it will come within a few years, a few months. They talk about the environment, they talk about food safety. It doesn't matter what the issue is, unless it's about pandas. When China is in the news, it's not positive. And Chinese Americans are in the news more than ever, and it's not always positive either. So now that we have achieved prominence, it's up to us to make that productive. Thank you. It is an honor to be at this conference. This is only the beginning. Thank you so much. Because of racial profiling, when we are singled out and targeted, that is wrong. So that's been a cause for every civil rights group in every community: mutual defense, anti-stereotyping, refusing to be subordinated, to be subjected to wrongdoing. The other potential cause, and this is not without its risks, but the Committee of 100 has embraced it since it was founded 27 years ago, is bridge building between the US and China. We have an ability, not just an affinity, not just how we look, but our ability to understand culture and language, to reach out so that when we travel to Beijing as Americans, we send a different signal, it's a different message than when our coworkers and neighbors do, and so we can reduce tension and misunderstanding and play a productive role as bridge builders.
Hi, Professor Wu, thank you so much for speaking. Your speech is very inspirational. You mentioned the case of Vincent Chin and also the multicultural political movement that happened after that, which I think draws a lot of parallels to what's going on in our nation right now with a lot of the police shootings and the Black Lives Matter movement. But to me, it seems the Black Lives Matter movement hasn't really drawn the same kind of multicultural following. And I was wondering, what is your opinion on how to get more people than just the African American community involved in this, because it seems like an issue that should affect all of us.
Yes, the hardest thing is to see that it isn't only Vincent Chin, who looks like he could be our uncle or brother or us, but that there's a principle at stake. That the racial profiling that affects Sherry Chen and Dr. Shi is the same as affects people of Arab descent, same as affects African Americans when they're driving and they're pulled over for no good reason or for a busted taillight that the rest of us, well, we wouldn't be pulled over for that. It's the same as the notion that everyone of Hispanic descent is undocumented and is here to commit a wrong. What is at stake here is the notion that we are not judged by ethnicity, by the color of our skin. So your answer, I would say, the answer to your question is it's up to us to see this. It's not up to African Americans to persuade us. We have to come around to seeing that if we want other people's help, we have to lend a hand first. And every single Asian American in public life knows this. Everyone elected to be governor or a member of Congress, they're all running in districts that are not predominantly Asian. They have to appeal to whites and blacks and Hispanics. That's another way we can build bridges, because we can see more than one perspective. The world is not literally, nor is it figuratively, black and white. It's on us, as the kids would say. I think I can just take one more
yeah, one more question. Yeah, I was going
Okay,
to.
because I persuaded my good friend Karthik to come, and he is great, and he's got all this data, and I told him, this is an Asian audience, bring all the data, they're really going to love it, all right? So you really want to hear him. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. It's Qinghua Ling. I'm from New York. I'm a quintessential first generation Chinese immigrant. I'm an engineer and speaking with a Chinese accent. I would say
and that's great.
Two quick questions. One is that at this time, what do you see are the most urgent thing we can do as a community? And second half question is that long term, how we should do going forward? Thank you.
There's so much to be done. Half of success in life is just showing up. The other half is showing up again. So, you know, not just showing up here, but at the local event held by the any other group, the NAACP, the American Jewish Committee, National Council of La Raza, to make sure that you are there for them. Not just to pose for a photo, not just in a token manner, but that you will get up early and march and carry a sign. Just showing up. Showing up means so much. You know, I'll close with this thought. People have sometimes said to me, well, haven't we achieved what we need to achieve? Aren't we post-racial now? Don't we all understand that stereotyping is wrong? The events of the past 18 months, it seems to me, have proven that in no way are we post-racial. Race matters now as much as it ever has, even more. Tensions are high, relations are fraught, there's suspicion all around. Suspicion in every way, and there are those who would be destructive and appeal to the worst parts of our nature, the voices in our head that are not constructive, that are only angry, and that don't channel that toward coalitions and bridge building. Every day, every single day now, when you pick up the newspaper, you go on the web and read a news article, China is in the news. And it's almost always negative. Doesn't matter what the issue is. There are people who talk about war, that war will come, that it will come within a few years, a few months. They talk about the environment, they talk about food safety. It doesn't matter what the issue is, unless it's about pandas. When China is in the news, it's not positive. And Chinese Americans are in the news more than ever, and it's not always positive either. So now that we have achieved prominence, it's up to us to make that productive. Thank you. It is an honor to be at this conference. This is only the beginning. Thank you so much.